Jane Goodall, Dr. Goodall. She's been a hero of mine for a long time, and a hero of yours, I'm sure. Because of her, we now view other life on Earth differently. Before her, animals didn't seem to have much to say. They didn't seem to be anywhere near human beings in their qualities. And now, because of Dr. Goodall, we know they make tools. We know they have great affection for each other. Chimpanzees over 50 years, they will have deep affection and show that affection for each other. Chimpanzees were also thought to be very, very peaceful, and Dr. Goodall found that they are not always so peaceful. So because of her, we now view life differently. And the line between human beings and other animals is now not so thick. We now know what will be lost because of Dr. Goodall in the future, because of climate change and ongoing biodiversity collapse. She is not only a scientist, and as I read in her new book, The Book of Hope, which I highly recommend that you all not only read but buy, she talks about the fact that she prefers, and I think I have this right, she prefers to be called a naturalist. When I read that, I thought, that's a word you don't hear much anymore. When I was a kid, I wanted to grow up and be a naturalist. And the distinction she makes between scientists and naturalists is interesting. And again, I'm oversimplifying this, but basically, science focuses on data and hard facts, and naturalists focus on more than that. They include the science, but they focus on matters of the heart. I wrote a recent book about animals called Our Wild Calling, and in it I believe that there are two environments. There are two environments. One is the environment of natural life, of the natural world. That habitat we spend a lot of time protecting and teaching our children about. And then there's this other habitat, which I call the habitat of the heart. And that habitat is between you and a coyote you see going by. It's between you and eagles on the shore. You can feel it. Hundreds of stories that I collected for that book, that theme came up again and again, that there was something there. Martin Buber, the great intellectual, who I always have to make sure I don't say Justin Bieber. Martin Buber talked about that between two people, as a kind of electricity that some people call God. Listening to the stories that I listened to, I came to think of that habitat of the heart in the same way. Kids seem to feel it more than adults, but we can reclaim it. Here's the deal. Those are two habitats, the natural physical habitat and the habitat of the heart. If one of those habitats goes, so does the other one. In the decades to come, in the years and the months and the days to come, we have to pay more attention to the habitat of the heart. The future of life on Earth depends on that habitat as much as it does on our perception of the physical habitat. Your work in connecting kids to nature, and Dr. Goodall's work with Roots and Shoots and all that she does as an ambassador for nature, reminds us of that. And so thank you again for all you do. It is sacred work, and it's the kind of sacred work that Dr. Goodall has been doing for many decades. So, Dr. Goodall.
Hello, Richard.
Oh, I'm sorry. You're going to run a quick video. Yeah.
Oh.
For real this time.
In 1960, a young British woman ventured into the forests of Africa to follow her childhood dream, to find a way to watch free wild animals living their own undisturbed lives. She left everything familiar behind and ended up giving the world a remarkable window into our closest living relatives. She was me. I wanted to come as close to understanding animals as I possibly could. We are continuing our research at Gombe. It's the longest running study of any non-human animal, and we're using some exciting new technology to learn more about chimpanzee ranging patterns and the state of the forest. And this helps to inform decision makers on action to be taken to protect chimpanzees, their habitats, and the other creatures that live there. I flew in a small plane over Gombe National Park, and I was absolutely horrified at what I saw. So quickly, it seemed, the environment outside the national park had been utterly destroyed. The trees had gone. The land was over-farmed and infertile. They were struggling to survive. And that's when I realized that unless we helped the people to improve their lives, there was no way we could even try to save the precious chimpanzees. This was when we started Take Care or Tukari, our community-centered conservation project. Everywhere I went, I met young people who seemed to have lost hope. They all said more or less the same thing. We feel like this because we think you've compromised our future. And so that led into our program for youth, Roots and Shoots. The main message of Roots and Shoots is that every one of us makes a difference every single day. The program has now become a movement that's in 100 countries around the world. One of the things that the Jane Goodall Institute does that I feel is really most important is to try and give people hope, to help people understand that every single day we live, we can make a difference. And together, with everybody making a difference, we can change the world.
I can see you there, but I can't see you here.
I can see you right there.
Okay, good, thank you. I thought maybe we would begin by talking about childhood, specifically your childhood. I understand that you, as a child, liked to bring earthworms into your bed.
That was when I was 1.5 years old. I don't remember it, but my mother said afterwards that, Jane, you were watching them so intently. I think perhaps you were wondering, how do they move without legs? That was my mother. She supported my love of animals. She never got cross. I mean, the bed was full of earth. She could have got mad at me, but she just said, I think we take them out because they need the earth or they might die.
And I also understand that you disappeared into a chicken coop at some point and your parents couldn't find you.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. Mum took me for a holiday onto a farm. I was 4 years old. And so I was given a job of helping to collect the hen's eggs. And so after a bit, I began asking people, but where does the egg come out? Because I couldn't see a hole big enough for an egg to come out. Nobody told me. So I went into a hen house and waited for 4 hours. And finally, I did see a hen lay an egg and where the egg came out.
And Sean, who works with you, told me yesterday that the remarkable thing about that story is how your mother responded.
Absolutely. And, a different kind of mother. I mean, there was that scientific curiosity. And the story's actually a bit bigger than that because I saw the hen going into an empty hen house and I thought, she's going to lay an egg. And I crawled after her. Big mistake. She flew out with squawks of fear, I suppose. And that's when I thought, well, no hen will lay an egg here. And that's when I went into the empty hen house and waited. So that little 4-year-old child showed all the making of a scientist, the curiosity, asking questions, not getting the right answer, deciding to find out for herself, making a mistake, not giving up, and learning patience. It was all there, and a different mother might have crushed that early scientific curiosity. Same with the worms, perhaps. And I might not have done what I've done. And it all points to the importance of parents supporting their children, what the children love, unless, of course, it's something horrible.
And I understand that your mother did not quit supporting you because when you were 26 and went to Tanzania to study chimpanzees, for your safety, your mother came with you. Is that right?
Not exactly. I mean,
Okay.
First of all, I was 23 when I first went, and Mum did not come with me. And that's when I met my mentor, Louv. Okay. And it took him a year to find the money for me to go and study the chimpanzees. And so finally he got the money. Then the next problem, at that time, Tanzania was still under British colonial rule. It was Tanganyika, taken over from the Germans. And the British authorities refused permission. We're not, okay, this is ridiculous. A young girl out in the forest full of dangers, there's leopards and buffaloes. We can't have this. But finally they said, all right, but she can't come alone. She must have someone with her. And so Mum volunteered. So I had money for just 6 months, and she came for 4 of those 6 months. Did an amazing job for me. But by that time, when she had to go back, the authorities, well, I suppose they thought I was slightly crazy, but I was okay.
Let's talk about hope, perhaps, for a while. I really enjoyed your book. Your book does give hope, but realistic hope. A few years ago, I began to talk about what I call the dystopian trance, that we have been trapped in a dystopian trance in which all we can see in the future is negative, is the end of things. And at some point, it's easy to become addicted to despair and to stay in that trance. And I felt for a while that the only way to get out of that trance is through a particular kind of hope, imaginative hope, to be able to visualize a future you'd want to go to. Yolanda King spoke a few minutes ago, and her grandfather said and demonstrated in many ways that any movement, any culture will fail if it cannot paint a picture of a world that people will want to go to. I believe that that's what you've been doing, is painting that picture. How do the rest of us follow your example and continue to paint that picture?
Well, I think that having got some vision of how the world could be, we then have to step back and say, yeah, but the world isn't like that. So I see hope as something very active. And I imagine that the human race is at the mouth of a very long and very dark tunnel. And right at the end of that tunnel is a little star shining. That's hope. But it's no good sitting at the mouth of the tunnel and hoping the star will come to us. We have to gird our loins, whatever that means. I love that expression. We gird our loins, we roll up our sleeves, and we have to crawl under, climb over, and work around all the obstacles that lie between us and the star. And that's climate change, loss of biodiversity, poverty, war, aggression, all these terrible, terrible problems that we're faced with. But as we go through that tunnel, we reach out to others. And fortunately, there are people on the planet who are equipped to tackle these different problems. And we take them with us. And as we go, we're tackling the problems. And if we don't give up, and we get more and more people coming with us, together we shall reach that star.
It seems to me, in addition to that, that we do, by the way, David Orr, who you may know, who's an activist on climate change, David told me once that hope is a verb with its sleeves rolled up. I think we need to acknowledge our despair also. We need to not wallow in it, but recognize that it is real, and there are real reasons for that despair. Not long ago, I met a guy on a mountain near where I live who had become very attached to that mountain, Vulcan Mountain, east of San Diego. When he was a boy, his parents would take him up and they would camp. And that attachment never left him. And I learned that for years, he had been going up to that mountain a couple of days a week from San Diego.
Sound.
Can't hear?
Sound's gone.
Sound is gone, guys.
Oh, now I've got you back.
Oh, good.
No,
I didn't go anywhere.
And unfortunately, I can't lip read.
Well, this guy had been taking pine seedlings up to this mountain for years because it burned several times and had been really devastated by fire. And he determined that he was going to replant this mountain. And then one day, after years of doing this, he was in his truck at the base of the mountain and he began to sob because suddenly he realized that because of climate change, it was going to burn again and again and again. And he felt that deep despair that many do feel. But that wasn't the end of the story. That was several years ago. He's been planting trees there ever since. He didn't stop. That kind of courage and hope in the face of that despair, and in the face of what is happening around us, I find inspiring and almost mystical. And I know you've spoken a lot about the spirit in nature. And I wonder if you could talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, but first, before I talk about the spirit in nature, which I feel a very strong connection with, but to go back to your despair, many people come to me and say that they've lost hope, the world's in a complete mess, and they're just falling into despair. So if you fall into despair, you fall into apathy and you do nothing, and we're doomed if we all do that. So when they come to me, because the world is in such a mess, I say, yeah, but think about where you live, your community. Is there anything there that you don't like? Maybe you don't like litter in the street. Maybe you don't like homelessness. Maybe there's something else, stray dogs or something. See what you can do about that. Get other people to help you. And then you find, gosh, I have made a difference here. And that makes you want to do more because it makes you feel good. And you're gathering other people and everybody's inspiring each other. And when you realize that all around the world, that's why I love our Roots and Shoots program, that around the world, other people are making these differences, then you dare think globally. So what we're told is think globally, act locally. It's the wrong way around. Act locally, and then you dare to think globally.
Yeah.
So coming back to your actual question, sorry, Richard, about spirituality. When I'm out, particularly in the forest, because for me it's forest, for other people it'll be mountains or something, I feel a very, very deep connection with a spiritual world. And I was sitting in Gombe one day, there were no chimps anywhere near, and I was thinking about, the fact that because we love naming things, we have a spoken language, we like to give a name to things. So this connection we have with the natural world, with the spirit world, we call whatever it is our soul. It's our soul, that spiritual aspect of ourselves. So I thought, if I have a soul, then these chimpanzees have souls too. It's a little spark of the divine in all living things, something that the indigenous people have long understood, that the animals and the trees and the plants, and in some cases even the rocks and the mountains, are all connected to us in a spiritual way. They're our brothers and our sisters. And that's how I sort of look at the world.
I think of the fellow I met on the mountain. He brought pine seedlings that day, of not giving up. And I've asked several people who are doing those kind of things, even though they do feel despair, why they do that. And his answer was he feels that he's in touch with what he called the totality. And because it makes him proud of himself, that he doesn't give up. So many of the people in Roots and Shoots, the young people that you've worked with, have not given up. So many of the people in this room, hundreds of them in this room today, have not given up. They are imagining a different future, and they're working to create that future. One of the topics that has come up again and again is human loneliness. We're in the middle of a pandemic, but there is another pandemic that is occurring simultaneously and that preceded this pandemic, which is the pandemic of human loneliness that medical folks have been saying for quite a while now, that human isolation produces many of the same diseases, or is associated with many of the same diseases as obesity and smoking. And that this isolation we feel is actually killing us. I felt that in addition to the usual things that are blamed for human loneliness now, which is Instagram and Facebook, and we can only blame so many things on Zuckerberg, that there are other reasons. There's bad urban design. People are told to walk. Walk where? You'll run into a freeway ramp. There are more walkable cities now, or attempts to make them walkable, but it's pretty tough because of bad urban design. There's also fear of stranger danger, when in fact, at least until recently, violent crime toward children and families was going down for about 40 years in the United States. But we have the impression that it's going up always. There are other reasons, all of which seem to be the same reasons that kids don't go outside anymore. So that isolation from each other is translated into isolation from nature itself and a kind of species loneliness. And this precedes those other things, that we are desperate as a species to not feel alone in the universe. Why else would we look for Bigfoot? And by the way, my son, Matthew, told me I need to ask you about Bigfoot. He believes in Bigfoot, and maybe you can speak to that in a minute. But to the degree that we do connect with other animals, we feel less alone in the universe. And a lot of people found that out during this pandemic. When they looked out the window and for the first time recognized there were birds there, and those birds helped them feel not so alone. And now to Bigfoot. If you could, for my son, share your views on Bigfoot.
All right, I'll share my views on Bigfoot, and then I want to come back to animals helping us feel less alone. But first,
Good.
Bigfoot. Well, I am a romantic. I want there to be Bigfoot or Sasquatch or Yeti or whatever. Every single country has its version of a Bigfoot. And I've got a couple of stories I'll share quickly, which, they're pretty amazing. So I'll share one. There's not time for more. And this was, I paid a visit to Ecuador, and I went right deep, deep, deep into the rainforest. We went in a tiny little four-seater plane and visited about 4 communities. There were about 30 each, like a chimp community. And they maintained contact with each other by sort of more or less like the traveling minstrels who went taking news and gifts from one community to another. And they were hunters. So I didn't meet any of them, but the man who was interpreting, I said to him, if you made these hunters again, these communicators, could you ask them? All I said was, have you seen a monkey without a tail? No more than that. And about 5 months later, I got a message. He said, I talked to 5 of the hunters. Every single one of them separately said, oh yes, we've seen a monkey without a tail. It walks upright and it's about 6 foot tall. That's my best Bigfoot story to share with your son. But going back to animals and us, 2 things there. First of all, it's our disrespect of animals that led to the pandemic in the first place. Right. Trafficking them around the world, selling them in wildlife market, and our terrible factory farms where billions of animals are crowded into these horrendous conditions. Right. And by the way, also are destroying the environment. But it's this disrespect of animals that enabled viruses to jump from an animal to a human where it may form a new so-called zoonotic disease, such as COVID-19. But during the pandemic, it wasn't just that people saw the birds, heard them for the first time perhaps, looked up in some cities and maybe for the first time in their lives saw stars shining brightly instead of through a haze of pollution. But think of the number of people who found comfort in dogs, people who were alone, whose dog was their companion. And although some people gave their dogs back afterwards, most of them didn't. And there's something about the dog is man's best friend that is so true. But we're finding it now crows can solve problems as well as 8-year-old children. And the octopus now is so intelligent, and its brain is completely different from ours. It's got brains in every one of its 8 arms, right, as well as in the central brain. And if you cut an octopus arm off, only please don't, that arm will, for a while, behave just on its own. It will do things like curling itself around a fish.
Well, first, my son will be so happy with your affirmation of his belief in Bigfoot. And by the way, he went on a hike in the Sierras with a buddy a few months ago, and he heard the typical banging on the trees that people who cite Bigfoot talk about, and he heard it, and it grabbed him. And so he ended up staying up all night, out in the trees, scared to death, but listening to that knocking and hoping he could pin the source of it. And the sun came up and he realized it was squirrels throwing nuts. But he still believes in Bigfoot. So how do we magnify what you've done with Roots and Shoots and what the Children in Nature has done with so many of the good people here today? How do we grow that?
Well, first of all, since the pandemic, I have been sitting here. This is the house I grew up in, by the way. My Tarzan books behind me and Dr. Dolittle. And every single day, including weekends, including holidays, every single day, I have been doing Zoom talks, conferences, lectures. Virtual Jane has been busier than I've ever been in my whole life. And a lot of it is to do with talking to schools and universities, talking about roots and shoots, growing the program. But we only grow really grow by making partnerships, like the partnership between Roots and Shoots and children and nature. So that's really helping us to spread faster. And then as we spread, we get young people who are so inspired, our youth leaders, and they're spreading it. And it's no point just going into a country and saying, now I'm going to start Roots and Shoots. It doesn't work that way. You have to find somebody who feels the passion, who realizes this is something really that I want to do. And then they start it off. It doesn't always work, but usually it does. And even if a program closes down after a year or two, you still lit that spark in hundreds of children in the meantime. And you know, we're very, very strong in university, and our university leaders are doing a great job in spreading the program in primary schools, even in kindergartens.
And we hope that Children Nature Network can help you do that, and that we can, through the partnership, help grow the movement. You know, you also pioneered something else, and you alluded to it there, which was when you would go into areas, you would actually engage the local people in the solutions, and not impose the solutions on them, but ask them what the solutions are. Many of the people in this room are doing the same thing in their work. Our prize winner here earlier is doing that in her urban neighborhood in Baltimore, and not only engaging them with designing the park that she has built, but creating a community garden, and they have goats and lots of animals in this urban garden, and they're feeding people in the neighborhood as well, or providing food for them. How can that be ramped up? How can governments start to do that, for example, not only nonprofits? I'm sure some governments are doing some of that.
Well, one thing which makes me very happy is that people who've been through the Roots and Shoots program in the school very often take it to university. And I found that the values that they acquire in Roots and Shoots, they tend, if they've really been active in the program, they take those values with them into sometimes decision-making positions in government, lawyers, teachers, and of course parents. And I've had so many examples of that. And one of the things I didn't mention about Roots and Shoots, you know, it's animals, people, environment. But because we try to bring young people together virtually, mostly, but face-to-face if we can, from different countries, people come together and interact with each other. And out of that grows a sense and understanding which they're not taught, but far more important than the color of your skin, your culture, your language, your country, even your religion, is the fact that we're all human beings. We all weep, we all laugh, we all bleed if we're hurt. And that is something that seems to really stick. And in the world that's so divided today, that's so, it is a terrible world. But if we get more young people understanding, well, they're humans. I don't absolutely agree with everything, but I respect their right to believe as they believe, unless they're believing in terrorism or something like that. And that's not the fault of the young people. It's what they learn as children. So what we learn as children is something that's really, really important. And I just feel so sorry for these young people growing up in these fanatical terrorist groups, because they believe that if they blow people up, they'll be rewarded in paradise. They believe it.
How does connection to nature reduce or help set the conditions that might reduce some of the violence. I know you've spoken about that before.
Yeah, but they did a famous experiment in Chicago, and they took two areas of high crime in a city, and one of them they greened. They put plants and trees and flowers in every space they could, and the crime rate went right down. So they very quickly greened the other area where the crime rate had stayed the same or even gone up. And so it was Japan that started the idea of forest bathing. I thought at first, what do you do? Put on a bathing costume and go into the forest and swim or something? I mean, I didn't really think that. But anyway, it means taking time in the forest. Or if you don't have a forest, find a tree, find something green. And in fact, not only in Japan, but now in Canada, doctors can prescribe forest bathing or time in nature because it's now been scientifically proved that being in nature helps your physical and mental health.
Dr.
I heard about a victim of, she came from Congo, and she'd seen her child killed in front of her, his head cut off. And so she arrived, as you can imagine, in Britain, totally traumatized. She wasn't speaking. And so her counselor took her into a garden and helped her plant a little rose tree. And as the leaves came out, and then as the rose began to open, so gradually through this experience of the growing flower, she began to come out of her terrible trauma.
I recently participated in my first forest bath with a counselor, a woman who's studying to be a counselor in forest bathing, and this was on Vulcan Mountain, that mountain I mentioned. And I was really amazed. We would go off and give an assignment, go find a tree that you can relate to, and listen to that tree. Now, I'm from Kansas, so I'm kind of a champion eye roller when it gets to New Age, but Outside Magazine recently accused me of sounding New Agey lately. So, but I was really amazed at the stories that they told when they came back about how they related to that tree or the animal they saw underneath the leaves. So often they spoke in what amount to parables, almost fairy tales, just naturally. As the day went on and people calmed down and they described what they were learning from nature, it did sound like fairy tales. It made me wonder if that's where fairy tales came from. But we're closed off to that so often. You mentioned that study. One of my favorite studies is, there's actually been several on this, is on schoolyards, green schoolyards, which I know you're interested in. And they found that kids who are playing on a green play space, as opposed to the typical asphalt or cement playground, the kids on the green play space are far more likely to invent their own games. That this has everything to do with the development of executive function, being independent, being your own boss. And this has, I think, long-term implications for the economy. If you want more experimental businessmen and all that, except maybe for Musk, get them out playing outdoors in nature. But the thing that was most interesting about these studies is the kids playing on those natural play spaces were far more likely to invite other kids who did not look like them, who were not the same race or gender, to come and play with them. That's part of what we were talking about earlier about the effect that nature can have. It doesn't always, but it can have on people's civility. And ironically, particularly in urban places, nature civilizes us. And we've been running from nature for centuries, thinking it was uncivil. That's my sermonette.
But it's quite true. So all of our groups, I think, are involved now in this tree planting, re-greening the planet, absorbing more carbon dioxide. protecting existing forests and restoring others. And so with this tree planting, I've always stressed the importance of urban tree planting and getting city councils not to cut the trees down when they get too big and ungainly. Those are the wise trees. Those are the old trees. Those are the trees that can teach us. But putting trees in an urban setting, it provides shade, it lowers the climate, it helps slightly more rainfall, or at least retaining the moisture. The roots stabilize the soil, so there's less danger of flooding. And the people can find nature inside the city. And, people have to realize that even in the inner city, even where there's no nature at all, we still depend on the natural world. Every breath we take, every mouthful we eat, it comes from the natural world. And it comes from intact ecosystems. And as we destroy ecosystems, we unravel the amazing mix of animals and plants that make a healthy ecosystem. So it's all tied in. I mean, everything that we've talked about, it's all interrelated. And we have to do it all together. It's no good just picking one piece of it and saying, well, this is what I'm going to do. You've got to find other people who say, all right, I'll do this piece, I'll do that piece. Because we can't do it all, but we must find people so that we create a healthy environment wherever we are.
Do you know Doug Ptolemy, the botanist and entomologist?
I know his name.
Yeah, he's a friend, and he has this idea that I promote him and this idea more than he does, because he's a very modest guy. And the idea is basically, what if people were encouraged, led by kids, to replant their yards in native species? And my wife and I did that, and all of a sudden we saw species of butterflies and other species coming back that we'd never seen before, in addition to the fence lizards that had always been there. And they make me happy, because I would look out the door and see them doing push-ups, the lizards.
Yes.
And I came to think there was more posturing in my backyard than in the U.S. Congress, but now I've had to change my view of that. But the idea of, what if it wasn't just our yard? What if it was the next yard, then a couple of yards over? So that you're essentially building, without waiting for anybody, you're building wildlife habitats based on bringing back insects that feed the whole food chain. And then you see birds starting up. What if those were all over the country? In fact, he calls it the homegrown national park. And I would like to see that even bigger, that we have a worldwide homegrown park. So kids in New Zealand or wherever could get on the internet and trade notes with kids in this city, in Atlanta, about the animals and the plants they're seeing show up that weren't there before. And that, combined with all kinds of other ways, as you say, urban planting of far more urban trees, that cities could actually become the engines of biodiversity, not just the enemy.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And what you're talking about, greening gardens and things like that, is helping to provide wildlife corridors, which are absolutely essential if we're going to protect biodiversity. Animals must be able to move. And of course, it's much easier to provide corridors for things like butterflies and insects and birds than it is for the landlocked creatures. But it's beginning to happen.
It is. And that's one of the things that gives a lot of people hope. The wildlife corridors. Urban planners are starting to understand that. Not fast enough, but they are. There's up north of where we live, outside of LA, they're putting in a huge overpass over the freeways there. That is a nature overpass that many animals will move across into corridors, including mountain lions. There's a famous mountain lion in Griffith Park, and because of that, the mountain lions where I live, we have mountain lions in our yard. I know that because I have trail cams there. And those mountain lions where I live, near Julian, which is up in the mountains east of San Diego, their tails are starting to get crooked. And that's a genetic change that is because they're cut off from mountain lions to the north. And these kinds of things, as you said, the wildlife corridors and these overpasses, nature overpasses, we can do this. We can imagine a new kind of city and create it.
It's sort of beginning to happen, not fast enough and not broadly enough, but at least people are thinking about it and talking about it. And then as the young people, our Roots and Shoots and your young people and the combination of them and various other youth organizations, they will grow up thinking about these things. And because of our amazing intellect, they'll have ways of doing it that are even better than anything we've thought of.
And I think there is something in us that we don't recognize enough, which is good. I'm sure you remember the giant fires in Australia in 2019.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. And some of the images that came out of the coverage of those fires were quite moving. People who had lost their own homes were running into the flames or riding their bikes into the flames, carrying water and food for the wildlife that were being burned. There was something wonderful about that spoke well of our species. And these days it's hard to find a lot of things that really speak well of our species. But we do have goodness in us.
We do. And when you have a disaster, like I was in New York for 9/11, just as one example. And for so many people, and with the pandemic, it brings out unknown qualities of courage and compassion that are there in everybody, but it takes a circumstance to bring it out. So we need to nurture in children that spark of compassion to help it develop and grow, that indomitable spirit that we have.
You probably know Glenn Albrecht. He's an eco-philosopher in Australia. And I asked him about those images. I asked him about that. And he, like I had been wondering, what will it take to really move people to action on climate change and biodiversity collapse? Because the data doesn't seem to be doing it fast enough.
No.
And his answer was, when you look at the great social movements that have moved people from information to action, they're all based on love. The gay rights, to a degree civil rights, certainly. It doesn't mean it's succeeded totally, but those are based on relationship. And all the others, social movements, they're based on love. And that we don't talk about that enough. We don't have that, and you do, but we don't have that discussion often enough. Your movement, Roots and Shoots, and the Children of Nature Network, the folks in this room, really their fuel is love, not data. And to that, I would add the kind of hope you talk about. Hope, the verb with its sleeves rolled up, that it can't just be the hope, it also has to be the action and the imagination. So I really thank you. They have the hook over here. So I think we're going to move to the question and answer period. Thank you, Jim. Thank you.
Wow, that hour went by fast, didn't it? Thank you, Rich and Jane, for that really inspiring conversation. So fun for all of us. We've got time, I think, for one question, and then maybe I might have a final question for each of you. But this is from one of our online listeners. It was so great to have people joining us both in this room and virtually from around the world. But this question is, how can we get grown-ups, us, I guess, policymakers, decision makers, to really listen to the movements of young people for our climate?
Dr. Goodall.
Well, that's exactly what we are doing with our Roots and Shoots program. It began for children, no question. And then it went from, high school to university. But now we're getting people, staff of big corporations, wanting to start Roots and Shoots within their corporation, and then linking their children, if it's an international corporation, with children of another. So these young people, as I've said, are going to grow up, and some of them will be politicians, some of them will be CEOs of big corporations, and they'll be bringing this ethic with them. It's something we aim for. Good question.
I think that one of the things I didn't understand when I was writing Last Child in the Woods is this issue of connecting kids to nature and getting over what I call nature deficit disorder has a special and unexpected power. It has the ability to get people who don't agree and don't want to be in the same room into the same room. And I've seen conservatives sitting next to liberals, sitting next to developers, sitting next to conservationists, and doctors sitting next to lawyers, people who usually stay in their own silos, sitting down at that table because they care deeply, not only about their kids, but about other kids, that they had what they had the privilege of having maybe when they were kids, which is that connection to the spirit you were talking about, that connection to nature. And, I wonder, how can we use that more to reduce the polarization that seems to be tearing us apart?
Well, thank you both. Maybe each of you would just offer some closing remarks. Well, hold on. I guess I've got one more question. This is from Jane. Oh, for Jane. Not from Jane. I hear you still have Jubilee, and it was a spark for your life. Is this true?
Well, I still have Jubilee. It was given to me when I was 18 months old. Right now, he's in Dallas. He's part of the exhibit, the Becoming Jane, that the Geographic created, that's slowly working its way around the US. And Jubilee is in a bulletproof glass case sitting in that exhibit. Everyone thinks because he was a stuffed chimpanzee that started my interest in chimps. Absolutely not. I did adore Jubilee. But when I went to Africa, I would have studied any animal, any insect, any bird, anything to be out in nature. So what people think that Jubilee started my chimp thing isn't true. And also people assume chimpanzees are my favorite animals. They're much too like people. My favorite animal is a dog.
That's great. Well, Rich and Jane, thank you so much. And I'm wondering if you could each just offer a brief remark in closing and to send this group off as we'll go back to our home communities after having been together in community. And would you just offer some closing thoughts for us?
I would like Dr. Goodall to have the last word, so I'll talk first, which is, earlier in our conference, we were reminded that we need a sense of humor and that this is a happy cause, ultimately. And I know you have a great sense of humor. And one of your folks here told me that you often say there are two Janes, Icon Jane and Whiskey Jane. So I've been thinking about Whiskey Rich as a name. So.
Okay, well, it's quite true. I like to have a little tot of whiskey to recover from the stresses of the day, and also mostly with friends, of course, so you get together and you relax, and it's just a fun thing. But my last words would be to all of you, particularly all of you young people. I see some of you in the front row there. I can't see your faces, I can only see the back of your heads. So if you turn around for a moment and look behind you, I'll see your faces. So just turn around. Yeah, hello there. I can see you. Thanks. Anyway, so my message is to all of you, don't forget, every single morning when you wake up, think, I make a difference. My life matters. what I do today is important. Think about what you do. Think about how you talk to people. Think about how you treat animals. Think about how you bother or don't to water a little dying plant. And just remember that every day you make an impact on the planet, and you can get to choose what sort of impact you make.
Thank you. Thank you.